Well, good afternoon, everybody. Please, let's all take a seat. Well, we have the pleasure of having the last panel of the day, so I hope we will invigorate you and keep you interested and excited. It's actually a very important topic that we're here to talk about today, which is about the opportunities and the impacts of purchasing practices and how that leads and enables businesses to meet social and environmental standards in the supply chain. So we've heard a lot today that sustainability and responsible business is no longer an option. We've heard a lot about that it's a commercial imperative and that it involves integrating sustainability into the DNA of the company. I heard that earlier today. And I think that movement is reflected not just in this sector, I think it's across all sectors. In January of this year, Larry Fink, the CEO of the world's largest asset manager, $6 trillion assets under management, wrote to the CEOs they invested in and said that long-term corporate value creation is fundamentally linked to social and environmental impacts, positive social and environmental impact. We need to move beyond short-termism. But are we really there yet? Is that ambition for social and environmental standards to meet international standards in the supply chain, are we there yet? Are workers' lives improving as a result of, particularly in this industry, 20 years of history of social and environmental auditing? And this is where we're going to look a little inward, particularly at the brands, and looking at the impacts of their own purchasing and the ability of manufacturers to meet those standards. Because, in a way, manufacturers are facing a dilemma. Because, on the one hand, costs are increasing, particularly if they're going to invest in upgrading factories, if they're going to invest in labor and wages and health and safety and environmental protection. But at the same time, prices are getting pushed down over time. So there's a dilemma there. Who is going to pay for the factory to be upgraded? Who's going to pay for wages and a living wage of all the workers and the millions of workers that are depending on this sector? And it's sort of a situation for the brand, in some brands, where the right hand is kind of digging holes and setting purchasing practices that are driving prices down. This is the typical narrative you hear, in fact. While the left hand is kind of trying to fill holes in through their corporate code of conduct and social auditing. Now, how prevalent that really is, we want to explore that today, because actually what we've seen and what I've been talking with the panel is that there are a lot of good practices that have emerged and are just starting to emerge to address this issue. And purchasing practices of brands is part of it, but there's a lot of other pieces to the puzzle here. So I have a pleasure of moderating this panel. We have a great group of speakers representing manufacturers, brands, representing workers, and of course also representing government as well. So we're going to hear from a lot of perspective, and I'm going to start with Catherine Chieu, who's the General Manager for Corporate Quality and Sustainability at Crystal International Group Limited, a large manufacturer supplying a lot of brands worldwide. First of all, just to give people a flavor, how prevalent is this problem? How much do purchasing practices actually affect your ability to meet the codes of conduct and social environmental standards set by your customers? And what are some of the emerging practices that you've seen in terms of your engagement with buyers that can help you overcome those challenges?
Mm-hmm. I would like to make an example. Say, for example, brand put a price for an order to me, which is $1.1, right? So, and then we accept the order and we try to produce the order. But there are some discrepancy in the purchasing process and also merchandising process, like poor order planning, last minute change information, suddenly cut the order, but keep the same delivery day, something like this. So it's totally affect factory's production planning and also our supplier. We will decrease our efficiency, which does have impact to workers' income. Overtime, sometimes this month overtime a lot, and then next month nothing to do. These all are factory costs. So it's become our cost will be higher, but the factory output is lower. So in this case, what would the cost go? As a manufacturer point of view, we have to do the cost cutting. So there would be some impact to the labor practice or code of conduct. If brands keep on doing like this, there will be we predict there will be two ways. Factories will soon disappear in this garment industry, or they will keep using the substandard factory because factories just do not have enough money to maintain good labor practice. So, but for grade A, B, C factory, for the higher rate ranking factory, which they really care of labor practice or code of conduct, they have to have some margins in orders. They have to maintain some profitabilities in order to maintain a good labor practice, good code of conduct, and also to increase their competitive power, like the increasing of quality, innovation, and speed. So for this kind of factory, they are not able to accept any order without profit all the time and in long term. So I would like to make a very good example that a responsible brand, which they really care of quality and labor practice, when they put the price to their vendor, they would really consider the factory survival and also the factory profitability. When they work with the supplier, they will really put the true cost, which under the consideration of factory profitability, and make a fair price, a market price, not a squeezing price. And based on that market price, they also help the factory to fine-tune the process, which can maintain factory's efficiency, help us to put the productivities. That will impact the good earning to workers. On the other hand, these brands also hear feedback and accommodate requests from the supplier. They make their own change, they re-engineer process to cope the need of a manufacturer, to create a win-win situation. So it's a long-term partnership, and also it can create a long-term profitability for garment manufacturer. So we do have this kind of customer.
Thank you, Catherine. Indeed, I think, well, a few things that come out of what you've said. First of all, what is the true cost here? And I think the partnership approach that you sort of alluded to about, it's incumbent on the manufacturer to understand what the true cost is and then engage in a dialogue with their customers on what those true costs are. And you've also highlighted some of where there might be some vulnerabilities, lead times, for example. Next, I'm going to hear from the brand perspective, and we have two brands here. One, Shelly Gottschamer, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer of Outerknown, a relatively small brand, but at the end of the supply chain and growing. And then we also have Bill McRaith, Chief Supply Chain Officer, PVH, a parent company to a number of large brands. So we're going to have a couple of different perspectives, but I think they're going to overlap. From your perspective, Shelly, what are some of those vulnerabilities, if you could elaborate a bit more, that you see? What are the red flags in your own purchasing practices that could lead to some of these issues of the manufacturer ability to meet environmental or labor standards? And how do you overcome to address that and looking at your own practices?
That's really great. Thank you for the introduction, and really happy to be here. Purchasing practices is super important, and I'm really glad to be able to talk about it. Outerknown is an emerging brand, so it's really interesting to have the perspective from a very large player to a young, nimble, emerging brand. And thinking about purchasing practices, really the key indicator is poor planning. So that's lead time, order size, capacity, stuff like that. And I'm going to throw out a couple examples to share with you. And a common one is a chase order. So as a brand, you get a new order, you're chasing it, you go to your supplier who's told you, it takes 45 days to make this order, but hey, Mr. and Mr. Supplier, I really need you to make it in 30. So what is happening when you do that to your suppliers is most likely you're creating overtime or illegal subcontracting, which are in Outerknown's code of conduct and are things that we audit against to make sure that's not happening. And another less common example out there is your design or merchandising team is like, hey, we're adding this really great style, and I need it in a week. I need to approve it, I need to get it to market, and your supplier is giving you a lead time of 2 weeks, and you need it in a week. So what's happening is your pattern maker, your sample sewer is probably working overtime to get you that sample that you need. So from those two examples, you can really see that there's a lot of different areas in the company that this touches, and cross-functional alignment is super important. Outerknown is a Fair Labor Association accredited brand, which is super exciting in of itself. And the Fair Labor Association follows a principle methodology, and they have a principle against responsible purchasing practices that really looks at the management systems for a brand in your internal processes, like forecasting lead times, capacity planning, internal and external training, and that's been a really good mechanism for Outerknown to really bring the supplier into our conversation. And then the other thing that I want to talk about as an emerging brand, we work with some of the best suppliers, which is great, but being a small player, mission-driven, we frequently lack the leverage at these suppliers. So following responsible purchasing practices enables us to engage with these suppliers because we're following really good methodology. So those are kind of some super important things. And my last point is you hear a lot about equal partnership and supplier ownership, but I think before we look at that, we first have to look at ourselves and our practices and how we impact our partners in the supply chain.
Thank you very much, Shelly. And I think that point of really holding up a mirror is something that really emerged in our planning into thinking about this before, looking at your purchasing practices and just the way that you do business. So I work for the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We have a standard that was endorsed by almost 50 governments on due diligence in the supply chain for every actor, that it's a shared responsibility for every actor to check that they're observing these standards. And it was the first government-backed standard that said actually brands and buyers need to look at their own practices, purchasing practices in particular, and how that is driving or contributing to some of these impacts. But I know, Bill, this idea of holding up a mirror and thinking about what can we do better from a purchasing practice perspective, but also more broadly is something that you've really touched on quite a lot. So what has been your experience, obviously a much larger company? We've heard about cross-functional alignment being key, maybe more difficult for a larger company, maybe not. The importance of pooling leverage and the differences of leverage is something that's emerged. But Bill, what do you think from your perspective? What have been some of the key factors from your own performance that can lead to better performance in your supply chain?
So let me, I've got to give a caveat before I start. So first of all, look, I just think there's a lot of great work going on across the industry, right? So I've got to apologize up first if anything I say makes it feel any different. I do respect the work that's going on. I'm going to pull 3 words from the presentation by Simon earlier this morning, which is really hate, fault, and stop, right? And so I think by the end of this, half the audience will hate me, but maybe you'll talk to me afterwards. Fault, I think the one thing I recognize is first and foremost, and I'm the Chief Supply Chain Officer for a fairly large organization, that whenever there's an issue within the supply base, the number one person who is responsible and at fault for that is myself, right? And I'll come back and touch on that in a second. And stop is you need to stop me when I run out of time. So those are kind of the three things I'm going to share. Look, the background of me, and I think it's important to understand my background, is half of my career I was a supplier, building supply chains in China, my own factories in China, pretty much all around the world, and supplying many of the brands that actually, some of which I work for today, many larger ones across the US and Europe. And I have to tell you, I can show you the scars on my back as a consequence of the bad and shameful behavior of those brands. And so one day I turned up in the US and I actually became the head of supply for one of those companies in the US. I remember when I arrived, one of the head merchants said to me, "I'm glad you're here with us, Bill. You'll now fix the supply base." And my response was, "I'm not here to fix the supply base. I'm here to fix you." Right? And what I realized is that it was just this lack of everyone woke up this morning to do a good job. Anybody wake up this morning to do a bad job? No? Okay. So everyone woke up this morning to do a good job. The challenge is we tend to be ignorant of the challenges that each other have, and we do not talk to each other and communicate with each other. And there's this thing in the industry that I refer to as false hierarchy. Sometimes merchant designers are at the top of that pyramid, and the suppliers and trim suppliers are at the bottom, and everything cascades down. That is not how it works in my world. There is no hierarchy. What there are is a set of people who are working hard every day to make as much money as they can. And don't be shameful about the fact you're trying to make money, right? But if you can clear the false hierarchy and suddenly start to look into your own practices, because you use the right word. You know, look, I joined the company 6.5 years ago, and I entered a company where anything that went wrong, cost of goods were too high, quality was poor, on-time delivery was late, some type of challenge that was out there, the instant reaction was, it's the supplier. 96% of the time we could track that back right internally and figure out we had actually caused the problem, but we weren't looking for it because it was too easy to blame the suppliers. So look, I have a personal passion to say, whatever you are looking at that in the supply base. Now, a lot of the conversations for me this morning were about the work that we're doing with the suppliers, the work that we're doing with the mills, the work that we are doing in the supply base to improve the situation, improve living wages, etc. I would tell you, before you do any of that work, so I'm going to kind of mirror what you said, look in the mirror, right? Whatever exists out there, we created it. The supply base looks exactly like what we created. And if you want to change what that looks like, first of all, start to look at yourself and fix the actions. You know, this morning we spoke about we might have to pay more for transparency. Honestly, it's bullshit. It's just wrong. There is so much waste in the system that we have created. The average labor price in anything that you or I am wearing today is around 10 to 15% of your product, right? Manufacturer, costing engineer by training, it's about 10 to 15% of what we are wearing today. And yet there's this belief that we've got to go after lower and lower costs of wages. That is not true. There is so much money to be had by looking at how we improve our engagements with our suppliers and how we do it on a level basis with our suppliers. The word partnership is generally used to get something off someone, right? Well, I need the supplier to partner with me, and it tends to be a one-way conversation, rarely the other way. Look, and so one of the things we are doing is saying, how do we create metrics on ourselves? How do we establish KPIs internally that measure how good a job we are doing to our suppliers? Because if you think about it, is we are actually the supplier of information, POs, tech packs to the supplier, and if we can't meet our delivery date or the quality of the information we committed to, do not ever expect your suppliers. So never hold your suppliers to us higher standard than you are prepared to hold yourself to. So look in the mirror. Look, and the last thing I would leave you all with in here is, I wonder if you went back to your own organizations and asked the design team, what are their metrics? How are they rewarded, incentivized, or on your CR initiatives that you have, whether it be transparency, whether it be living wage, whether it be product sustainability? Are your design teams measured on it? Are they rewarded for it? Planning, merchandising? I think way too much we're in an industry where the vast majority of the people probably here today are represented from CR teams. I don't think it's the CR team's responsibility. I think it's everyone else's responsibility in the business, enabled, catalyzed by the CR team to go drive that work. So look in the mirror.
Thank you, Bill. Looking in the mirror is something that clearly is an emerging theme here. That upfront engagement, involving all the different business units, also as Shelly said, as soon as possible. And looking at the incentive structure is something that certainly has emerged quite a lot in the discussions around this. But I really wonder how prevalent this is. And I mean, are we talking only preaching to the converted here? Because ILO, working with the Ethical Trading Initiative, just put out a report not too long ago, a survey of around 1,600 suppliers in 87 countries. And they've said, those suppliers have reported that in less than 20% of their customers are willing to factor any labor costs into their pricing discussions with their customers. That's what that's what the survey response have said. But at the same time, over a third of those of buyers themselves are driving price pressures down on them. And often 55% of the suppliers reported selling below their own costs just to keep their competitive advantage, mostly future contracts. So obviously this is still an issue. And I want to now turn to Christina Hajagos-Clausen, who's the director of textile and garment industry for IndustryALL Global Union. You know, you've been a real leader in this partnership and collaboration approach, and also, of course, to ensure that the voice of the worker is really part of this. And not only because it's the good thing to do, but also it's the commercially correct thing to do as well. So perhaps you could elaborate on, you know, what are some of the practices that you've been working with, particularly in collaboration, to address this issue?
So thanks, Tyler, and the rest of the panelists. I think one thing that's really key from IndustryALL's point and our affiliates is to be able to have a voice at the table on these issues. As many of the panelists described, purchasing practices have an effect on working conditions and wages. So I think one of the key initiatives that we've collaborated with, and that's through ACT, which is Action, Collaboration, Transformation, is on how do you link purchasing practices to living wages and to industry-wide bargaining. So today on the panel, I'm really just going to try to talk about the purchasing practice side of it and what the brands with the collaboration have done on looking at purchasing practices. And I think, you know, it was highlighted here about looking in the mirror. This is what a group of, you know, the 19 brands who are members of ACT, we worked on a survey, like a critical self-assessment tool to look at your own purchasing practices. The brands did that, and it's through the organization. It's just not the CR team. It was from designers to merchandisers to buyers, all the way down. We were able to then kind of say, this is a benchmark of where these brands are. And then the piece that's important for us was then to look and to see what were the purchasing practices that had the greatest negative impact on wages and working conditions. And once we, you know, this is a collaborative process that we're in, how do you identify those and how do you change them? And I think what's one thing that's very important is that, you know, specifically, you know, that Bill brought up, it's not the it's not the sustainability department's work. I mean, it is part of it, but it is the buying. So how do you close that gap between the sourcing teams and the CSR teams? And I think, you know, as a supplier, you feel that gap, right? You know what the CSR team is asking, and then you have the buyers coming in, you know, demanding certain price points. So I think the work that's really key in this field right now is how do you identify them and how do you make a systematic change and a systemic change, because this is not solely for one company, this is across the industry. So from a global perspective, and this is a global supply chain, we really feel like there needs to be a systemic answer and a systemic way to work forward. And that's the work that ACT is working on in purchasing practices. So some of that inefficiency in the system, how do you grab that and ensure that that is linked to improvement in wages and working conditions? So I would say that this is I would say this is more like an industrial relations. When you say collaborative, I mean, we have a counterpart in that, and that's, employers. So unions and employers have this role in the supply chain. So we're saying, especially around purchasing practices, that these can be agreed upon changes that can take place, and then how do you bring it back into your business? We're specifically trying to link it to wages and industry-wide bargaining, but that one piece has to happen within the businesses themselves.
Well, thank you, Christina. And I think the opportunities that, and already the results that ACT has driven, I think, speak for themselves. And what is also very interesting in relation particularly to purchasing practices is this opportunity that ACT provides to really pool leverage, to really bring people together and say, together we can drive the change. And if we all commit to the same things, the world won't collapse and not one person's going to run away from the table or walk away from a certain manufacturing center. We're committed, and if you raise the cost, we will stay engaged. And I think that is part of the message that helps to make that effective. But we've heard now, of course, the worker perspective, the manufacturer perspective, the brand perspective. I did want to hear from governments, and we have the pleasure of having Arne Lietz here, who's a member of the European Parliament and has been a real champion of due diligence in the garment supply chain, responsible supply chain management, also from a European-wide perspective. So what's the role of government here? Often in these discussions, it's really a lot of pressure on companies, a lot of pressure on buyers particularly, and I think this is about starting to look in the mirror a little bit for everybody. But what is the role of governments here to help create that space for responsible purchasing practices and also to make it really commercially viable?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. You have been a very inspiring situation for me as a parliamentarian in the European Parliament. I'm a young German social democrat who took this topic up. And it's interesting, we had giant demonstrations for TTIP and CETA for international trade. What is happening, trade is not only a national situation anymore. In the European Union, and I assume most of the people here are citizens of the European Union, we are giving this into the hands of the European level. So we have some national initiatives. If you talk about governments, I actually feel that they move forward. We have a big initiative in the Netherlands. We have a big initiative in Germany. They're trying to move together with the business, with the NGOs, with the policy situations. But yet, they have to not went to the European level. We have to be there. And that means we have to have standards for the business communities who I feel, when I talk to them, would like to have actually a European standard, not a national standard, because this is not as it works. And so we have to move towards that next step. And I've been bringing this topic up in the European Parliament, and the Commission told us that they will have a garment flagship initiative, which somehow never came out. I was even speaking at a conference where they wanted to leave it out, but that didn't happen. So we had a parliamentary decision, we had a parliamentary resolution bringing these topics up, where we, for example, call for due diligence, which needs to be legal binding. So OECD now with their report last year, now this year coming up again, is a good support for us. They're not only looking at garment, they're looking at shoes, but also on leather. So there are new topics we have to bring in. We now have to bring the national initiatives to the European level. So I work with a German initiative, textile initiative, with Minister Müller and his team, who's also here present. The Netherlands people are there. So we bring this to the European level for the national initiatives. They're doing a roadmap through Europe, and they're looking at due diligence and trying to the alignment of assess the OECD standards. So we have to bring this to this level, but also having our trade situation. We have some special trade deals with Bangladesh, with other countries. We support them, which is an important asset for them to develop as a country, but nevertheless we have to call in OECD standards, we have to call, and I really like, and it's very important to have ACT and have businesses who are in the lead, and we have to support best practices. That means I'm, as a parliamentarian, in my region, I do Fashion Revolution Week, and I'm a patron of my area. We do a fashion show in the European Parliament with members and hopefully commissioners as well, to have public awareness of that. We're going to our classrooms. So ask wherever you're from the European Union, you're a member of parliament, what do you do on supply chain or textile? Have you been supported that? And what do you do? It's all to the citizen, not only who made my clothes, what is the campaign, but also what are you doing as a parliamentarian, because it's on the European level. And so I like what is on the national level. We have some countries which move ahead. We show best practices. We invite best practices into the European Parliament. And so therefore, we're trying to be bringing this to the swing, and there's a long way to go. But ACT is an important cornerstone because this is really on the global level. And so we don't only need labels like this shirt, like the suit I'm wearing has been Fair Wear Foundation supported. What we need is that our clothing, which is sold in the European stores, are fair, are sustainable to a certain level. So it's not only to have marks, what is on which level, but also we need this as a standard. So I call on you as citizens to be with the movements and with the NGOs to work on this together.
Thank you. Well, clearly the role of governments, please. Clearly the role of governments and also the European level is also to help level the playing field. You know, so if one country is doing it, they don't feel sort of that they're going to be put at a competitive disadvantage in some way. And I think what we're hearing is we need to flip it on its head, that, you know, it becomes a competitive advantage to observe the highest standards for a number of reasons. So I see we've run out of time, but I'll take a chair's prerogative and say, if we had a magic wand, each of you in 20 seconds, what would you do in terms of to make responsible purchasing practices the reality and not just, you know, a sort of patchwork of good practices here and there? So I'll start with you, Shelly. The magic wand, I'll pass to you first.
Very quickly, bring your supplier along with you and think about what you're asking them to do, because they're people too.
Great.
Well, I don't only work on the European level and bringing the SDGs and the textile questions. What we have to do is having the supply chain down to public procurement. So having the fireman, the nurse in your hospital, but also the green department of your city wearing fair and wearing sustainable public procurement is on the politician side. So fight for this with your parliamentarians.
Thank you. Catherine?
Brands should tighten the standard in labor practice, but at the same time, they have to give a fair market price to the supplier and don't squeeze the price, which is far lower than the normal one.
Thank you. Christina?
So for me, it would be purchasing practices include negotiated wages as an itemized cost. So something very practical that your survey indicated was missing.
Yep. And?
Yeah, I would say, look, align yourself with like-minded suppliers that you can have a long-term relationship with, what I call go on a journey with, and then ask them to put metrics on you and show you just how bad a job we do for them to unlock the value for your end consumer.
Great. Well, we're out of time. It was a lot of territory to cover in 30 minutes, so we rushed through some of this, but hopefully this has sparked some thinking on your side with a lot of lessons here: upfront engagement, partnerships, real two-way communication with suppliers. I want to note that we're really focusing on sort of tier one, cut, make, trim here. We haven't even started thinking about responsible purchasing practices for raw materials, so raw material producers can also meet these standards. I mean, that's another, maybe next year's discussion we can have that. But I just want to thank you all for listening, and thank you to the panelists for a rich discussion, and thanks to the organizers of this.